we really need to understand the regional, racial, ethnic, gender, and class diversity of the Asian American experience. And last but not least, Filipino Americans and their experiences within the US is very unique. Once again, this is the only Asian country that was a former American territory. And I really believe that we can study the Filipino American experience through food. You're able to look at the values, beliefs, and traditions that revolve around food. And food also distinguishes cultural identities. This can be viewed as an edible identity. And with food, it also points to intangible and tangible forms of cultural heritage. Intangible because this represents cultural knowledge, and tangible because food and the food practices that surround it is very much material. It not only concerns food products, but also the cooking utensils and equipment and the spaces used to produce, process, and eat food. And so food leaves a material footprint, and it can also be viewed as embodied material culture, a special form of material culture that's produced specifically for human consumption. So, with the materiality of food practices, you can examine this not only in the archaeological record, but also museum objects, oral histories, ethnographies, archival records, and literature. And really, with this list, this is actually all the different multiple lines of data that archaeologists can use to supplement whatever they learn from the archaeological record. So this slide is here because I just wanted to point out and orient people to where Philippines is. So as you can see, this is in Southeast Asia. It's a cluster of islands within the Pacific Ocean, or actually the Philippine Sea. And the people that we'll be talking about who immigrated to California in the early 20th century, most of them come from the larger island of Luzon. So I don't know if you can see my pointer, but I'm circling around it. It's this northern island up here. And so people who are from the Ilocos, or people who are of the Ilocano ethnicity or Visayan ethnicity, they were the ones that mostly immigrated in the early 20th century. And those are the people that really stayed and settled in California. I just want to add that, I talk about Filipinos, but really it's a lot of different ethnicities who live in the Philippines. So that's actually over 100 ethnicities in the Philippines. So now pulling back into Central California and the topic for today, Filipinos came to Central California because there was a rise of the agricultural industry in the early 20th century, where new technology and an understanding of soil or soil fertility really pointed to the San Joaquin Delta as this epicenter of agricultural progress. And so with this booming industry, it really needed an affordable, migratory, and seasonal farm laborers to grow and harvest their crops. Well, Filipinos back in the early 20th century, they didn't have a lot of opportunities to delve into other industries or to really climb their way up in different occupations because of the racial politics at the time. So farm laborers and farm work was really an opportunity for them to make money. So they congregated in the San Joaquin Delta, and particularly in San Joaquin County, which you see outlined in red to your left on this photo. And then the middle is Stockton City, where Stockton City was actually home to Little Manila, an ethnic Filipino neighborhood. And at one point in time, this was actually the largest Filipino community in the United States. Depending on the season, depending on how many Filipino farm workers were in the area, this actually fluctuated the population from a couple hundred to a couple thousand. And so Filipinos lived within Stockton City and Little Manila, but they also lived in these outer lying rural areas that had a lot of fertile farmland on farm work camps. So people that were in California at the time were mostly men, mostly because a lot of the agricultural companies tapped Filipino men back in the Philippines to come work in these agricultural businesses. Not women and not children. It's really targeting Filipino men. So at the time, there were few families and there were few women. And most of the people were the Ilocano ethnic group, and some were Visayan. So coming into this new country, looking for new opportunities, trying to escape an impoverished Philippines that was still recovering from the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War of the early 20th century, Filipinos were coming to the US for a better life. But they came to the US and met all these different challenges. Carlos Bulusan, who is a Filipino-American writer of the early 20th century, who also worked in agricultural in California. He wrote a book called America's in the Heart. It's part fiction and part autobiography about his personal experiences. But he says, I came to know that in many ways it was a crime to be Filipino in California. I feel like a criminal running away from a crime I did not commit. And this crime is that I am a Filipino in America. If you look to the right, these are actually letters or messages really sent to police department in the Delta. I'm not quite sure which town, but this basically, captures the anti-Filipino sentiment at that time, where they wanted to get rid of Filipinos. They didn't want Filipinos getting these agricultural jobs that other people were also trying to get. So within California, Filipinos were not able to purchase and own property under the anti-alien land law, which basically dictated that you had to be a citizen in order to purchase land. They were also not able to marry white women under the anti-miscegenation law until 1950s. They also faced housing discrimination until the 1960s, where realtors were not willing to sell them land even if they somehow were citizens. In the agricultural business, they faced low wages because they actually had to talk to the farmers and try to negotiate a fair price for their work. But once again, Filipinos were not necessarily welcome in the US, even though the industry, the agricultural industry, wanted them, needed them to be the backbone of the agricultural industry to cultivate and harvest these crops, these fruits that would feed the rest of the nation. And so within this racial climate, Filipinos were threatened and Filipinos did encounter forms of violence. So in bringing this back to the work camp, the work camp in itself is a very common type of archaeological site, not just for agriculture, but just in any part of the U.S. that experienced a regional development for a certain industry that required a large but seasonal workforce. So this can be in logging, in mining, in creating CCC dams throughout Nevada and other places in the U.S., in creating the Hoover Dam, other hydroelectric projects, railroad development, or other kinds of infrastructure. So this is not just specific to agriculture in California, but within California, because agriculture was and still is such a large industry, the farm work camp is a very prevalent archaeological site, but not much is known about them, and particularly about the racial and ethnic groups that usually occupy them. However, historical literature, research, and oral histories point to the poor living conditions that most farm workers endured. If you've read The Grapes of Wrath, then you know a little bit of what they talk about in terms of poor working conditions, unsanitary conditions. Sometimes they weren't, fed well. So there's a lot of literature and information out there about how farm workers, not just Filipinos, but farm workers in general, were treated very poorly. So for Filipino work camps, there is a certain camp organization. Usually camps in of themselves were formed because people came from a certain town in the Philippines and they spoke the same dialect. They were Visayan or they were Ilocano. And they really found out about work and formed these camps through their community networks. So typically you have a labor contractor who is typically head of this camp, and they're the ones that go and negotiate fair prices, fair wages with a farmer. You also have a camp cook. This could be a singular person or two. And they're the ones that purchase supplies from ethnic grocery stores in Little Manila, or are able to produce food through gardening, through foraging, hunting, fishing, in order to cook meals for the crew. And then, of course, you have the farm workers, the laborers who make up the bulk of these camps. So there's really not one way to look at these camps. There's a diversity in how these camps manifest themselves with the housing, with the structures, or even just the size of these camps. With the people I've interviewed and the things I've read, camps can vary from 10 people to 100 people. So there really is a great variety with Filipino work camps. And here's a picture from the Fons Museum. This shows Filipino asparagus farm workers in the field. And you see that they're clutching these tools, these implements, which are basically asparagus knives. And so usually when you see photographs of Filipino farm workers in these kinds of fields, they're always stooped over these fields because they have to stoop down low in order to chop the base of asparagus with these knives. And here is an example of a work camp from Ryer Island, so also within the Delta. And one of the people I interviewed talked about the Spartan conditions of the work camp he grew up in. He says, I do remember that it was very Spartan conditions. The men had their own bunkhouse. There were 2 buildings. One was single story and the other was 2-story. And they had a central shower and commode facility that you had to walk to. Where we stayed, of course, it was 2-bedroom and the restroom facilities were inside in the house. And that was kind of what the physical plan looked like. For this person in particular, he was actually the son of the camp cooks. His mom and dad were actually the cooks of the camp. So for daily meals, he talks about lunch being fish with rice because that was easy to digest and that was also easy to carry out into the field. For in the evening, his mom and dad would cook rice and vegetables with fish, pork, or chicken. And then for breakfast, they would have eggs, they would have toast, coffee, butter, or a type of jam. And he also fondly remembers having the biggest jar of peanut butter that he had ever seen. But of course, that was because the camp had a lot of workers to feed. So for his camp, it was actually up to 40 men working there. And then the photograph to the right, this is actually a photograph of a kitchen in one of the Filipino camps. Not necessarily the one that he came from, but this kind of shows or gives a general idea of what the kitchen may look like. And then I want you to take note of the large pot that's on top of this wood burning stove. I'll get back to that in a sec later on in the presentation, but for now, just take note that there's a very large pot. So as I mentioned before, the camp cooks would procure supplies from ethnic grocery stores in town where, sometimes you didn't have money to pay for all of the supplies. And so something that I noticed and something that I learned from my research was that there would actually be store credit that was offered and available. Because a lot of these people knew that there wasn't money at the beginning of the season. People didn't make their money until the end of the season. And so there would be a ledger of credit where people basically, have the amount of money that they owe to this grocery store listed in this credit or this ledger of credit. And so aside from ethnic grocery stores, aside from foraging and hunting and fishing, people are also known for gardening, for creating their own food in order to feed themselves, feed their families, feed their crew. So one of the other people I interviewed, she talked about how the camp cook created a garden so that they could cook the vegetables that they needed for pinakbet, which is a Ilocano cuisine. So she says, he would make these rows, take abalone shells and put them at the end of each row. I don't know where he got the seeds, but he had bitter melon, he had okra, he had saluyot, he had eggplant. I think he had tomatoes. Then he had some kind of leaf that was kind of slimy. Tabangao, which is a long, long squash that hung from his fence. He just loved doing that. So even with looking at this oral history, if you look at it from an archaeological perspective, already you're getting an idea of things that you may encounter in a Filipino garden. And if you had the skills, of being able to do a faunal analysis, you may be able to discern data from the seeds. So to the right on this photograph, this is an example of pinakbet. As you can see, it's sauteed vegetables, and it's sauteed with shrimp paste, a fermented shrimp paste called bagoong, and also fish sauce. So it's funny because I still don't really know where they got bagoong. I don't think it was really sold in stores at that time, or maybe the people that I've talked to didn't know if it was sold in stores, but they have mentioned that some people made their own. And so here's a photo of the Filipino American Agricultural Life 1920 and 1950 exhibit in the Fonz Museum in Stockton. This really gives you an insight of what a Filipino camp may look like. And this really all comes from one Filipino camp in a nearby county. The Hamero camp actually housed up to 100 Filipinos at one point in time. And so this is mostly donated from that one family. And here's a closer look at some of the things that you may find in their kitchen, in their dining hall. So to the left, you have a makeshift homemade stove and pot, and just take notice of how large that pot is. And I think the stove in itself, I mean, it looks like it's made out of a barrel. Like they cut a barrel, they cut a hole under the bottom, or not under the bottom, but to the side so that you can fit wooden logs in there and then start a fire. And then to the bottom, you have a regular pot, a ladle, and then on top of that, or the pot is on top of a cabinet that's actually made from crates. And then to the right, you have more homemade furniture from wooden crates with tin enameled plateware and a mug. So even though some of these, like the stove on the left, doesn't look that familiar, the other things that you see here are very familiar. These are things that you and I may be using or could use or have used. And here's a picture, also from the exhibit, of the Hamero kitchen and dining house. And then to the bottom right, you can see what kind of stove that they use and also the type of equipment. So once again, it's this large pot. It's called a kawa. Really, it's really a wok. So this is intended to cook large batches of food for people, which really works out for a farm work camp because you have these super large crews that you need to feed. But traditionally, in the Philippines, kawas are also used because the idea of eating, it's not just for yourself. You're not just making food for yourself. You don't make single meals. You always make large meals to feed a whole family. And so with that, people eat kamayan with their hands or with utensils. And it's always a very social experience. You're always together around a dining table, sharing these meals. So you've learned now a little bit about the types of foods that Filipinos eat every day, and how they've procured that food through restaurants, or sorry, not restaurants, but through grocery stores or through the natural environment. But they also celebrate special occasions with feasts. And the fiesta is one special type of occasion that farm workers were known for hosting. I'm going to read this quote from one of the other people I interviewed because he talks about it pretty well. He says, "Then at the end of the season, as I mentioned to you earlier, they had what you would call a fiesta, a celebration of the end of a successful season. They would have what you call lechon, which would be barbecued pig over a spit, and some relatives, if they have any, some would come and bring maybe some pastries, biko or ensamada, to add to the food. That was the very first time that I had ever eaten pork rinds, fresh right off the pig. My uncle just took the butcher knife, cut me a nice little piece. It was hot, a little bit of the hair still on it, but I ate it." So with these fiestas, at the end of the season, people would celebrate. A camp would actually host a fiesta, And people within the camp and also their extended family, whether they lived in Stockton or other places within the Delta, and sometimes not even their family, but their town mates. So once again, pulling on this ethnic community network, town mates being people from their same town, they would all be invited to celebrate the end of the season. And with fiestas, with food being such a social experience, it allowed people who usually were isolated on these farms to congregate and reconfirm their community ties with people elsewhere. A Filipino American historian talked about the Filipino community as being a mobile community where it's not completely fixed to one place. They're constantly moving because of the farm labor opportunities. And so you have this community that's very dispersed, but for this one night, to celebrate this occasion, they all come together and have a fiesta. And looking at the ethnic newspapers at Hagen Museum, I've noticed that fiestas are also places where people not only come and congregate and celebrate, but sometimes it's also an active place to really create a difference for your community. One instance in one of the newspaper articles talked about a fiesta being held in order to raise money to build a church. And then another fiesta was held also to talk about the unfair treatment of Filipino farm workers and trying to hold out on trying to ask for higher pay from the local farmers in the area. So, fiestas as feasts are not necessarily just a place for celebration, but it's also these places where people can actively congregate and accommodate for these shared experiences and hardships and trying to build a better community together. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background about the lechon, which you see here on this photo. Lechon is a roasted pig, and as I mentioned in this quote, it's usually the focal point that's served in a fiesta. So with a lechon, this really comes from Spanish colonial origins. Pigs in the Philippines, there's a lot of indigenous pigs in the Philippines and have been for centuries. They're known in the Philippines. The eating of pork is a very much known and documented food practice for different ethnic groups in the Philippines. But domesticated pigs itself, they came from mainland China or Taiwan through Chinese merchants thousands of years ago. And through archaeological studies, we know that domesticated pigs were used as luxury goods, eaten specifically during ritual feasts, reaffirming social networks, or consolidating political power. So, eating pigs, eating pork, having them at feasts is not nothing new. However, lechon as a cooking technique, as a cuisine, is new. This actually was introduced by Spanish colonialists into the Philippines. And traditionally in Spain, this means roasted baby suckling pig. But it was adapted in the Philippines to really not be about roasted suckling pigs, but be about roasted adult pigs. And if you look at former Spanish colonial territories, you'll see that lechon is also prevalent in those other countries as well, such as Cuba and Puerto Rico, where they've adapted this type of cooking style and cuisine and made it their own in different ways. And now today, lechon is considered a national food in the Philippines. People still eat this. And if you go to Seafood City or any other Filipino store in Las Vegas, you'll see lechon. And I suggest you try it. It's pretty tasty. So biko is also a dessert that was mentioned in that quote. Biko is a coconut rice cake from coconut milk, sticky rice, and sugar. The coconut milk back then was hand squeezed from grated coconut meat. And in order to get grated coconut meat, Filipinos in the US would make this tool called a kudkuran, which basically was a coconut grater. So to the right, the photographs that you see are examples of biko. So while I was in Stockton in the Fons Museum, I was lucky enough to find a kudkuran that someone had donated that was made in the early 20th century and was donated to the museum. Um, and so Josie and Martin Arizon, they talk about how their dad would use this coconut grater in order to get coconut meat for them to eat, but also get coconut milk to be used in these desserts. So they say, it took my father 2 hours to get enough shredded coconut to make the sweet rice. He would take the fresh coconut in the shell in one hand and cut it with a bolo. It took one swift hard blow to crack it in half, and then he would give us the coconut milk to drink. This was a very special treat because it took so much work and it was made only for celebration. A baboy was killed, and all the special Filipino dishes were made for that celebration. So you can see with this tool that it looks like a bench and it's made from wooden beams. And there's wire nails that fix everything together. And then on top, interestingly, they don't just use any blade, they use an asparagus knife, like the one that I showed you guys before earlier on in the presentation. So this really shows Filipinos recontextualizing everyday objects that they have in their new homeland in order for them to continue their traditions that they learned from the Philippines. Here's another example of a kudkuran from a person that I interviewed. Once again, very similar in form and basically functions the same way. It's once again made from wooden beams. It has wire nails, and then there's another asparagus knife also fixed on top so that they can grate the coconut. And then, funny enough, as I'm searching information about coconut graters, I came across the Field Museum and their Philippine collection. So in the early 20th century, an expedition was sent to the Philippines to collect anthropological objects. And so they collected objects from all different types of ethnic groups all over the Philippines, from the northern part of Philippines and even from the southern part. And so I came across this one object, which was basically another coconut grater. And once again, same shape, wooden body so that you can sit on top of it, and then also a metal blade so that you can also grate the coconut meat. And here's another example, also from the Field Museum. Similar in shape, once again, with a metal blade and a wooden body. And so this really shows that this type of tool and this way of eating, this culinary tradition, has a long-standing history from the Philippines and then continued on in the US, where people took what they knew, what cultural knowledge that they knew in the Philippines, and creatively sought whatever materials that they could in order to be able to keep on practicing their traditions. So what do we do with all this information, with all this different kind of data? From oral histories, from archival records, from museum objects. As archaeologists, what can we say about the materiality of Filipino American food practices? And in turn, what can this say about the Filipino American experience in Central California? Well, first of all, food and food practices leave material imprints. So this is very much part of the archaeological record. So in talking about lechon, where you roast a pig over a spit, and you have a roasting pit underneath that spit, that leaves marks. In Southern Nevada, we talk about agave roasting pits. That kind of food practice left a mark on the landscape. And it's the same way with lechon. People have also left other marks in other ways, such as creating gardens or even having food remains from these feasts or these daily food practices. So in moving on to work camps, what can we say about these spaces? Well, work camps are not only spaces for labor or neutral landscapes. These are alternative domestic spaces where ideas about gender roles and family are recontextualized. Once again, most of the Filipinos in the early 20th century were men single men that had no families. So they had to create their own family. They had to create their own communities. And so Filipino work camps and work crews, in a way, were alternative households and alternative domestic spaces. And through food and through cooking, people were able to express their Filipino American identities, where they were able to combine traditional ways of Filipino cooking and cuisine with new ingredients and materials in the US. So something that has come up from other research has been the use of jackrabbits in another traditional cuisine called adobo, or even incorporating asparagus into this noodle cuisine called pancit. Jackrabbit and asparagus are not necessarily traditional items in the Philippines that are used in these specific cuisines. But coming to a new country, people were reinventing themselves and reinventing their ways of eating, not just because of circumstance, but because they were trying to figure out a way of trying to make their dishes taste good in a way that fitted their current conditions. So with this idea of combining new tradition or new materials with old traditions, this means that for an archaeologist, when we look at a singular object, we have to consider the multiple meanings associated for one object. I say that very lightheartedly, but this is actually a really big question in archaeology that is constantly debated about in terms of interpretation of an object or a site. But the only thing that I can say is that in considering Filipino American sites, um, having context helps to clarify the best possible association and interpretation, where we can look at not just the archaeological record, but also historical literature, ethnographies, oral histories, archival records to give us all these other lines of evidence that can say, hey, this is a Filipino American site. Filipino Americans lived here and worked here. And with these camps, feasts as social events really help to reaffirm community relationships and identities. As I mentioned before, feasts were not only celebratory occasions, but also places where people can try to create change for their communities. And with communities, community networks were used to overcome the challenges that they faced as a racialized labor population in early 20th century and mid 20th century America. And this was also done through this idea of bayanihan. It's a cultural ethos in the Philippines that has a long-standing tradition. But bayanihan basically means the coming together of a community to get things done and helping each other out. And through these farm work camps, through hosting feasts, through getting credit and providing credit through these ethnic grocery stores, people in their own way in the US were reinterpreting this cultural value of bayanihan into the Filipino American experience. So, for archaeologists, we have to consider that work camps are not isolate archaeological sites. The richness in data regarding work camps, Filipino work camps, comes from knowing and understanding that's part of a larger cultural landscape within a mobile community of farm workers. So that's really it that I have for today. I just want to say thank you to the SHPO Site Stewardship Program and also to my advisor from University of Illinois, the Fawn Society Stockton chapter, my oral history participants, the Fawns Museum, Hagen Museum, Little Manila Foundation, and the Gan Chai restaurant for, for letting me interview people in their restaurant, which is kind of funny and fitting because we talk about foodways and food practices. So that's all I have for today. If we have time for questions, I can answer a few. And I'm going to kick this back to Samantha and Rayette.
Well, Kat, that was really awesome. I learned a lot. I didn't know the complex history of the Philippines. I'd heard, about Spanish occupation and the U.S. And I've done a lot of research on the Chinese and the Exclusion Act. And so I didn't even think about where the workers were coming from, that the Filipinos were coming in and taking those jobs. Also, I see that there's a lot of parallels between the Filipino communities and, for example, the Southern Paiute when the settlers were coming over, they adapting and reusing new materials and trying to sustain their cultural identity and sense of place, which we see in the archaeological record here in Nevada. It's something that people don't really look at too often as the ethnohistoric period, that transition. But when you see projectile points and tools made from glass, and you see, you know, there's certain indicators that let you know, hey, this is happening in that period of time. So I saw a lot of parallels. So thank you again for sharing. And then, yeah, if anybody else has any questions for Kat, now's the time to go ahead and unmute yourself, and she'll be more than happy to answer.
I have a question for you. You mentioned with Filipino American history being largely absent, and this, at least your work, I'm not sure about other studies being done, but your work was really centered around the work camps and the men at the work camps. So how are women and children being represented?
Thanks, Heather, for your question. So it's a really good question, because within just historical studies of Filipino farm workers, the majority of studies has really focused, as you've mentioned, on Filipino men. And it's only in the past 15 years that people have really started looking specifically at Filipino women. I don't really think there's anything in terms of Filipino children just yet. I think that, or I know that right now, the movement has been towards looking at Filipino men, or sorry, women, and their contributions also within that area. So that's definitely something that people still need to look into.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, if no one else has any questions about the presentation, I do have some questions about how are you finding Las Vegas and your new setting. Our resources are much different than the East Coast, and you know, the work that you've been doing in California.
Yeah, it's completely different, but I'm really loving Southern Nevada. You know, I visited Las Vegas before, and it's amazing. And in some ways, I'm still trying to get a grasp of the diverse histories here. But I've done a lot of work in Gold Butte, and it's amazing there. And even the type of archaeological sites are amazing there. I'm still interested to learn about historic communities in the area. And so that's something that I want to get more information on. And if any kind of historical sites are on BLM land, I'm all up for it. You know, in general, I'm interested in Asian American histories, but you know, I'm also interested in that point of contact between this dominant society, aka the U.S., and then these other marginalized communities. And that's really something that's very universal, I think, in whatever archaeological work that you do. This topic can be found in whatever region, whatever country, of these two opposing forces, and how marginalized groups encounter and try to adapt and try to respond to this overwhelming majority, you know, society.
Have you come across any kind of like instances of Filipino history, particularly like interesting history or just like important history here in Las Vegas or in Nevada that some of this stuff might relate to?
So I haven't really found much yet in Nevada. There's a lot that's been done on Chinese immigrants and Chinese American communities, particularly centered in northern Nevada with the development of the railroad, and also with what's it called, carbonari production, so charcoal production in support of mining. But another archaeologist, actually pointed out to me that there is a historic building or historic site related to Filipino American history. Forgot where this site is or what this site is specifically about, but it's basically a large building that was owned by a Filipino family based in the Philippines. And they had this company that they wanted to start in Las Vegas. They were producing some
Oh,
kind
that's,
of
that's the one
goods.
out like headed out towards Beatty, or
Yeah, that one.
it's like it's
Yeah.
like it looks like
So
ruined now, but okay, yeah, that is a Filipino thing.
yeah, and so I am interested in learning more about the history of that one site. And I'm also interested in learning about any associated archaeological sites in association to that one warehouse. I'm wondering, where did the laborers that were working in this warehouse, where did they live? This is in the middle of nowhere. So where did these workers live? What did they live in temporary housing? Was this connected also to the town of Beatty? And why did this company building end up being destroyed by fire, I think, years later? So, this is something that I'm kind of interested in pursuing just because I think it's a really cool and interesting site. Um, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was Filipino history in Southern Nevada. I mean, once again, we're so close to California. And as I mentioned, there's a large population of Filipino Americans in California. But it's all about following the silences in historical narratives. Because usually when there is underrepresentation or an absence of a large group of people that were around, there's something there. And so I think it requires a little bit of digging.
So I wanted to say that, is it Biko? The rice? That is gluten-free and dairy-free, and I would love to find some.
I mean, Biko, you can definitely find that in Vegas. It's very common in Filipino stores also. I mean, I can probably make you Biko. I would be happy to make you Biko.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Okay.
I will hold you to it too, because I would like to try it as well.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll, any other takers, because as I mentioned, Filipino food is not meant for just, a few people. It's meant for a whole group. So in the spirit of Bayanihan, I can make Biko for however many people.
And I did want to, because a lot of the people who are on right now are volunteer site stewards or regional coordinators that work with the BLM Las Vegas field office. And I know there's been some changes that were going on there. And so Justin used to be our point of contact for the stewardship program for that regional Southern Nevada office. And I know you've started. What do you anticipate you doing with the BLM now that you're kind of getting settled in? Do you have any idea of where they're going to put you?
So yeah, we have a whole new crew of archaeologists in the BLM office. We have, me, we have Jennifer Dirk, we have Dagmar Galvin. Jennifer Dirk, I think, is being positioned as the lead LVFO archaeologist, and that's also because I'm going to be moving on to a different position in November as the district tribal liaison. And so for my specific vision for the cultural program, I'm very much interested in public engagement and also building relationships with communities. And for me in particular, because of this area, that would be, with the different tribal groups and their communities, and making sure that the archaeology that happens is, in some ways conducive to their cultural traditions and practices. I am also picturing expanding our relationship with you guys and with all the different volunteers. I know I've talked to the other archaeologists in the office, and we definitely want to go out to more sites with everyone and evaluate and record, and monitor with you guys. I mean, we have really cool projects coming up. If not within the next fiscal year, then definitely after that, just because these are long-term projects that we have to wait for more funding about. But yeah, I would love to go out with any of the volunteers or answer any questions that they have about archaeology, and really just build this relationship with everyone.
Well, we are glad to have you and really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to tell us about your research and to let us get to know you a little bit, and hope we can meet you in the field, and maybe you'll bring the Biko and we can have a little post fieldwork snack with social distancing and all that other stuff too.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So just let me know, and I'll be there.
All right, does anybody have any last questions that they'd like to ask? No? All right, well, thank you again.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good night and have a good weekend.
Thank you, Kat.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kat.
Bye.
Bye-bye.